Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to the 85th Learn with Lorna Stories from the Police Records. Now you'll be aware we're starting 2 minutes later than normal this week, and that was deliberate so that people could observe the 2 minutes silence if they chose to do so. Welcome to the series Learn with Lorna. My name is Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands in which we look after historic documents that tell the story of the Highlands history. We have 4 centres, as I say: the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, Skye and Lochalsh Archive Centre in Portree, and Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But as I say every week, if you're in a position to be able to donate towards our work, then we're incredibly grateful for that. This week is pre-recorded, as I intimated last week, because I'm supporting my colleagues at High Life Highland Adult Learning in an event that they're doing, which they have very kindly asked me to take part in. So this week is pre-recorded, but next week I'll be back to being live. But as I always say, if it's recorded, please do comment and chat, and my colleagues will pick them up, or I will certainly pick them up afterwards. We're continuing this week with our theme of crime and punishment, which will be our theme throughout November. Thank you for your comments last week about the witches one, and I'm glad you enjoyed it and found it interesting. And yes, it's quite an emotive subject and some difficult things to hear in there. This week we are looking at stories from our police records using the historic records of Northern Constabulary Police Scotland relating to the Highlands. We have a very large collection of police records with items across all of our offices, and they're full of stories. And I'm going to start by looking at a little bit of the history of policing in the Highlands, before then coming on to look at some stories from within those records. Now, there were constables in the boroughs from about the 1100s onwards, and also within the rural parishes from the 1600s onwards. So there has been a long history of having some kind of overview of kind of criminal activity, but it's really not until the 1800s that we see anything that we would recognise as a police force in the Highlands and in most of Scotland. Glasgow was the first in the UK, the first professional police force, and it's started around about 1800. But the turning point in a national context really came in 1839 with the passing of the Rogue Money Act. This was an act which enabled a fund to be collected in Scotland's shires and counties for the purpose of defraying the cost of apprehending, detaining and prosecuting criminals. So essentially it is a sum of money dedicated to the control of criminals and the oversight of law and order. The other thing that act did, as well as putting that dedicated fund in place, the other thing it did was provide for the establishment of police forces. It empowered the commissioners of supply to make an additional assessment from the rogue money to maintain a constabulary police force. And so that act, as I say, was passed in 1839, and some of the police forces were formed very, very quickly after that act was passed. So, for instance, the Inverness Constabulary was formed in 1840, very quickly after the Act. And it was the first police force to be established in the Highlands. It didn't include Inverness Borough, which came in 1847. So it was just the rural parts of Inverness that were covered by that county force. In Caithness, they were equally quick off the mark. So the boroughs of Wick and Thurso their police forces were formed in 1840 and 1841 respectively, and then the Caithness County Constabulary in 1841. And you'll see that split between counties and the boroughs so apparent and so important, and it is something I talk about week in, week out with regard to different record collections, but it's really noticeable in the police forces that which police force you fell under depended whether you were in a borough or in a rural area in the county. So this growth of services and formation of forces continued throughout the 1840s and 1850s. So, for instance, Wester Ross Constabulary was 1850, as was Easter Ross Constabulary. So you can see there a break between the county. These merged to become the Rossshire Constabulary in 1853. Sutherland County Constabulary came in 1857, and that ties in perfectly with the next piece of relevant legislation that was passed, which was the 1857 Police Scotland Act. The 1857 Police Scotland Act required that all counties that had not already done so establish and maintain a police force. So we've seen there that Rossshire already had a police force in place, that Inverness-shire did, Caithness did. But this act meant that if you hadn't already established a police force, then you were now required to. And it was also under this act that the role of Chief Constable was established, with the Chief Constable, of course, being the head of each force. So really comparatively late, I think, when we think about you assume that the history of policing is very long, and of course it is in one regard. But in terms of an actual recognisable police force, that doesn't come in until the 1800s. Now, R91, which is our Northern Constabulary collection, the reference number for that, it holds records from all of these stages of development, and also from various amalgamations and changes and subsequent changes that happened in that system. So 1839 a key date, 1857 a key date. As I say, various subsequent amalgamations, but the next really substantial date in this timeline is 1975. And 1975 is a key year. It's one you will have heard me mention before. This is local government reorganisation. It's when we stop having counties and boroughs. But also from a police perspective, that's when the Northern Constabulary was formed. And that was formed by the merger of Inverness Constabulary, Ross and Cromarty Constabulary, and what was previously known as the Northern Constabulary, which was Inverness, Orkney and Shetland. And then following that, in 2013, the merger of all 8 police forces in Scotland to become Police Scotland. So I think it's a really interesting example. You can really clearly see that gradual move from the very local, so a split even between Easter Ross Constabulary and Wester Ross Constabulary, or Thurso Borough and Wick Borough, for instance, having entirely separate forces, to becoming county-wide, to then merging counties. So, for instance, we get Ross and Sutherland Constabulary, to the one force for Highland, the Northern Constabulary, and then to one force for Scotland, Police Scotland. A very distinct move away from local to a much higher overview of the service. And I'm sure if there's anyone here connected to the force, they may well have some opinions on how that change has affected the service. So R91, that collection that I mentioned, includes records from 1832 up to 2000. There's a 75-year blanket closure on this collection, so this means that we can currently access up to 1946, but not anything later without permission from Police Scotland. And it consists of all sorts of things. There are the most common record series within this are Chief Constable's annual reports, returns and letter books, so that's for each force. The Chief Constable giving an annual report of what's happened in that force's jurisdiction, returns, and also letter books, copies of orders and memoranda and so on. There are some personnel records, and I'll come on to that in a second, but the vast majority are police station daily occurrence books. They are fabulous. I'm going to share some stories from those with you. But also, as I was writing it and as I was thinking about which examples to share, there's just so many examples. I may well have to come back and do a second talk about police records next year. There are also other items. So those are, as I say, the big series, and you'll have heard me talk about that with school records and so on, that there are the big series of records that you will always find. But then there are other sort of oddities or things that have survived from particular stations, things like that. So for instance, there are charge books, detention books, lost and found registers, books to do with registers of people who are allowed to do certain things in that area, juvenile whipping books, giving lists of punishment and young people who have been punished. And so those depend entirely on what survived in each area. Records relating to Skye and Lochaber, to Lochaber and to Caithness are held at those area offices. So as I say at the beginning, all of our offices hold records relating to their relevant local police. We're going to have a look, first of all, by some of the items that can be found in the Chief Constable's records. Then we're going to have a quick look at personnel, and then move on to look at those stories I mentioned from the police daily occurrence books. So let's start with the information that can be found in the records of the Chief Constable of each force. The Chief Constables were at the top of each force, and their letterbooks, orders and memoranda and annual reports contain a huge amount of information, a huge amount of social history, and also really reveal the range of things that the police were involved in. So for instance, this first entry I'm going to share with you is about the Suffragettes. It's from the Ross and Cromarty Copy Orders and Memoranda from the Chief Constable. So it's a big, big hefty book. There's a couple of them. They are substantial, big volumes, and with all sorts of orders that have been issued stuck into them, leaves and leaves and leaves of paper of orders issued by the Chief Constable about all sorts of different subjects. This is the first one I want to share with you. It's written by Duncan Finlayson, the Chief Constable, from the Chief Constable's office in Dingwall, 20th of May 1913, and it's entitled Misdemeanour by Suffragettes. In view of the vast amount of damage done by suffragettes and other irresponsible creatures to property throughout the kingdom, and the possibility of their extending their operations into this county by way of setting fire to houses, plantations and moors, I am desirous that the police throughout the county be vigilant in their beats, in keeping close observation on all strange women and known local ones likely to be influenced by strangers, calling for assistance where that may be deemed necessary with the view of preventing them from doing damage to property. Application for assistance to be made by speediest means to divisional or sectional officers. So, something there quite uncomfortable, actually, as much as we know all about that time in our history. The framing of the wording is difficult to read. I think other irresponsible creatures that they call the women who are trying to get the vote, strange women and women who are likely to be influenced by strangers. But it's something that, of course, in our heads we know the police are involved in the suffragette, in restraining the suffragette movement. But it's another thing to see it written down within our records. How about this one? This is also from that same volume of orders and memoranda from the following year, 1914. And in this one, of course, by this point we're into the First World War, and the police are being told by the Chief Constable to be vigilant. Duties of the police and foreign craft. I wish the constabulary stationed on or near the sea coast in this county to be observant of the arrival of all craft suspected of belonging to the enemy that may be taking shelter in places of anchorage, and to continue giving attention to any such that may after now arrive in creeks and bays for purposes as stated, and in every instance of all such being found, or that may be found, the facts to be immediately telegraphed direct to the Naval Office at Cromarty, stating briefly where found, the nationality and the appearance. This is to be applied to merchant craft as well as warships if they are suspicious or unusual in the neighbourhood. In order that the Admiralty may be able to recognise the source of such a telegram, it must be signed Police and the name of the station. And that was 4th of September 1914, so right at the beginning of the First World War. And again, it's just something that maybe we don't think about on a daily basis, is the extent to which our police forces were involved in maintaining order, issuing local orders, sharing information, dispersing information at a local level during the conflict. There are huge amounts of roles that the police played during the First World War. So, for instance, they were the ones that put out the posters in local areas telling people initially that there was a war, but also announcing things like the Military Service Act, going around rounding up people to serve their conscription. they were in charge of administering the special military area. So as I've said before, the Highlands certain parts of the Highlands were deemed to be of such significance that they were called a special military area, and entry into them was controlled, and it was the police that oversaw that. For instance, this is an extract from, again, from that same volume, and this is talking about the implementation that was soon to come of the special military area, that area that would be controlled people coming in and out of the Highlands. And this is before it's come into place, but they're alerting the police to the fact that as this law is about to come in, people might try and get in under the radar before that legislation comes in. And this has come from Edinburgh and then been shared out by the Chief Constable. Sir, it appears reasonable to suppose that enemy agents now in Great Britain will be desirous of ascertaining as soon as possible the reasons which have led to the proclamation of the special military area in the north of Scotland. So they're saying that, the enemy will want to know what's there that's of such importance, and they're going to try and get in. It also seems probable that they would take advantage of the absence of permits being required to enter the special military area until July the 25th. It is therefore desirable that a very strict scrutiny should be made of all persons who enter the area between the date of the publication of this notice, viz. 18th July, and the date of the enforcement of the special military area, July the 25th. Similarly, the police, both in other parts of Scotland and in England, are being requested to notify me of the departure for the north of any persons to whom suspicions attach during this period. And that's written by the head of the General Staff, Scottish Command. And as I say, sent to the Chief Constables, who then send it out to the stations. So that awareness that there's a piece of legislation coming in that will protect the Highlands, but until the moment that we have the authority to check that, people might try and get in undercover, and therefore we need to be especially vigilant in that time period. So again, just another hugely important thing that the police were undertaking at this time. And when you look at the police occurrence books for the same time, you can see that at the stations were stopping people they thought were suspicious. They were just taking part in all sorts of activities. Some police officers standing in as to train soldiers before they went. So a really wide remit. Now those three extracts are all from the Chief Constable's orders. In the annual reports that the Chief Constable wrote, there's fascinating information, facts, figures, statistics about the state of crime in the area covered by any given force. So for instance, in the 1885 Chief Constable's annual report for Ross and Cromarty, sticking with Ross and Cromarty for now, it reveals that the occupations of all those who've been convicted in that period of time, as well as their state of education. Really interesting. So it shows that of the 426 people convicted in the period covered by that annual report, 1885, there were people with occupations everything from horse dealers and kipperers to rope spinners, hairdressers and washerwomen. 53 of the people had no occupation, 74 were fishermen, 55 were labourers and 31 were carters. So it's obviously of importance to them to try and understand where people are coming from. Also, of those 426, 155 could neither read nor write. 37 could read only, and 234 could both read and write. So a fairly reasonably even split between those who were illiterate and those who were not. And they also had a statistic that said, again, around about half, 192 were under the influence of drink at the time they committed their crime, and 234 were sober. And I find it really, really interesting that they're quite clearly trying to work out commonalities. They're trying to find where the links are between occupation, between crime, between social issues such as employment, literacy, education, alcoholism, and to see if they can work out what the common factors are in people. Because why else would they be recording this sort of information? I mentioned that we hold staffing records for the police in our police collections. Now, there's not a huge number and it's not for every force, but we do hold some, including personnel record books and record and defaulters books, which I'll come on to in a second because I always think it's such an odd sounding title, record and defaulters. These volumes give detail about each member of the force. They give a physical description as well as providing information about meritorious acts or disciplinary action. So, for instance, the Inverness-shire Constabulary Personnel Record Book. It shows the journey of lots and lots of people within the police force, but I'm going to look at the story of one William MacDonald, just as an example to show you the sort of information that can be found within these. Now, William MacDonald was appointed on the 8th of November 1862 to the Inverness-shire Constabulary at the age of 28. He's described as having blue eyes, dark hair and a fresh complexion. He's a native of Inverness-shire who's been stationed first of all at Arasaig as a second-class constable. So you can see there already we're getting information about his hair colour, his skin colour, his hair, his eyes, information that you just may not get for most members of your family. So if you have someone who was in the police force, you may well find information within these. So that's the personnel record book. If we go to the record and defaulters book, it gives even more information. It gives details about his time off through the whole of his service. So, for instance, there's time off to visit friends, there's time off to attend his father-in-law's funeral. So that, again, gives you some information about his wider family. The records, the staffing records are really, really interesting. It also notes that he transfers from Arasaig to Inverness, from Inverness to Beaulieu, where he's appointed sergeant, from Beaulieu to Urquhart, from Urquhart to Stratherick. So you get an idea of his progression both up the ladder within the police, but also literally his progression around the country. And also it includes information about his actions, both meritorious and disciplinary. So things he's done well and things he's done wrong are all listed. So for instance, on the 16th of November 1869, he detected sheep stealers in action at Berrisdale, Knoydart, and was given a reward of £3 on the recommendation of the Chief Constable. Sheep stealing was a huge problem at this time, and the fact that he had detected this had led to him being given a personal reward by the Chief Constable. But it's not all good, because in June 1872, by which point he was a sergeant, but he was demoted to first-class constable for family quarrels and carrying firearms while on duty. So you really get the sense that this is the details of a lifetime in the force. So spent from the moment, recorded from the moment he joined the force in 1862, when he came from Midlothian Constabulary, right through to his retirement in 1891, which is noted that he's retired in 1891 on a pension. So you really just get an idea of a lifetime's service within those. So we've looked at Chief Constables, we have looked at some of the staffing records, but now I'm coming on to one of my favourite type of collection of series within this collection, the Police Daily Occurrence books. And as I said at the beginning, there are so many amazing stories in this. I could have just gone on and on and on, but I'm very conscious that time is short. So I'm going to select a few and I will do another talk next year. I am sad that I'm not here live to see some of the comments coming in here, but now the Daily Occurrence books do exactly what they say on the tin. Basically, they describe the daily happenings at each police station. So every police station would keep a daily occurrence book, like a log, and it would be completed each day with what the officer or the member of staff in charge had been doing. And they reveal information about everyday life in the force. So we see a lot of references to sheep dipping. So the police would attend the sheep dips. We see them attending polling stations, so just overseeing a vote. A lot of information about patrolling and the long, long hours that they worked patrolling. And sometimes those patrols were not very smooth. So for instance, this is an extract from Arasaig Police Daily Occurrence book. This is the journal of PC William Sharp from the 29th of June 1920, and it's a little bit about the condition of the equipment he'd been provided with. Now, again, I've never worked in the police force, but maybe someone will be able to shed some light. So he says, Tuesday at 10 a.m, engaged at station writing and patrolled the village, attended the trains and the police and the post office, so he's gone to check in with those places, and then proceeded cycling to Lochailort, called on Hugh Cameron, station agent, and on returning had a serious cycle accident on the public road about 3/4 of a mile north of Lochailort. My brake failing to act, my bicycle got out of control, with the result that I was thrown over the parapet of a bridge, sustaining serious cuts to the face and head, was picked up and conveyed home by car by Dugald Matheson of Lochailort. So it sounds like what would normally be a fairly safe patrol was a little bit dangerous on that occasion. Now, of course, these patrols were part of the prevention and detection of crime, and so the Daily Occurrence books contain some amazing and fascinating stories of crime from the history of the Highlands. Loads of stories of theft. Loads and loads of stories of theft. We have, just for some examples for you, the story of the cheese theft in West Wotton and Caithness in 1918. Interesting that there were various cheeses in the building, but not all of them were stolen, only certain ones. Theft of honey in Rogart in 1907. Lots of theft of carrots and cabbage and turnips. So for instance, I'll share this one with you from Cromarty Borough in 1886. Theft, 28th of October 1886. Reported by Acting Sergeant MacLeod, Cromarty, on the 20th of October 1886, that insofar as on the evening of this date, James McClellan, 13, son of and residing with John McClellan, alias Bold, fisherman residing in Fisher's Close, and James Watson, 13, son of and residing with James Watson, alias Peelan, fisherman. So that's all of that information telling you who's done the crime. So the crime is James McClellan and James Watson, and they're both 13 years old. They did each and both of them wickedly, feloniously and theftuously steal and away take from a field situated 200 or 300 yards to the east side of Cromarty House 2 or more turnips, the property of and in the lawful possession of Duncan Ross of Cromarty, causing loss and damage to the said Duncan Ross. So we take our theft of veg very seriously in the Highlands. So you can see there, theft of cheese, theft of carrots, turnips, really, apparently a real problem with food theft in the Highlands over a few decades. But not only food. So theft was also a problem in another area. So this is an extract from 1883 from Golspie, Police Daily Occurrence book. Wednesday the 21st of February 1883, at 10 a.m. patrolled the village of Golspie. Reported the following case of suspected theft of a pigeon. I beg to report that I am informed by Mr. Alexander Watson, painter, Golspie, that a pooter pigeon hen of his, pure white and feathery feet, went missing about the latter end of January last. He had the pigeon in a dicket along with the other pigeons at the back of his house where his garden is. The garden has a high wall around it, and Mr. Watson thinks that some boy might have stolen the pigeon. The pigeon was in the habit of flying out to the road in front of his house. If it was taken by any boy, I may have a chance of detecting the thief. And then a few months later we find, reported to the Chief Constable that Mr. Alexander Watson, painter, here informed me that some feathers were found in Mr. Fowler the architect's yard, which is situated close to Watson's house, and he has no doubt but a cat devoured the pigeon, as the feathers were found under plants, and a pigeon went missing from him some time ago. He then suspected that a boy had stolen the pigeon. So we've got pigeon theft in Golspie. What's happening in Gairlochie in Lochaber? Well, this is an extract from 5th of August 1897. Night duty. At 8 p.m. proceeded to Gairlochie and arrived there at 8:30 p.m. Anne MacDonnell or Cameron, 49 years old, wife of and residing with Hugh Cameron, lockkeeper, Gairlochie, gave me the following information and complaint. About 8:30 p.m, my son William Cameron came to me and informed me that one of our ducks had been stolen by a navvy. I went and counted the ducks and found I had only 10 instead of 11 as before. He also told me that he'd met the navvy going up the road with a duck under his jacket. I wish the thief to be prosecuted if found. The police officer then says, on getting her complaint, I proceeded along the road to Muckamer, and there I found the accused James Brown, navvy of no fixed residence, carrying the stolen duck concealed beneath his jacket. I apprehended him and conveyed him to Gairlochie, detained him overnight in a shed, and then on the 6th of August by mail gig to Spion Bridge and by train to Fort William, I handed him over to Inspector Chisholm there at 12 noon. So we've got pigeons being stolen in Galsby and ducks being stolen in Gairlochie, and the theft of canaries in Wick in 1916, and that's another sad ending. Like the pigeon, the canaries were eventually found dead at the back of the cupboard of the person who said they'd been stolen. But all of this pales in comparison to the bag of mystery potatoes which were found at Inverlochy Station, Inverlochy Junction, on the 14th of November 1940. And it says in the police occurrence book in red pen, which is what they used to report crimes, that these mystery potatoes had been found, but attempts were being made to trace the owners. And anyone who knows me and was speaking to me a couple of days ago will know that I came back to my desk and found a post-it note that I had written mystery potatoes Fort William, and I then had to try and work out why I would have written mystery potatoes on a post-it note. Now, I'm conscious I am telling fun stories and I'm laughing, but actually that was in 1940. Food was precious. We're in the, just a year into the war. It probably was a massive loss to somebody to lose that. And of course, I'm deliberately picking funny and light-hearted stories to share with you because they're there and that's fun to share. But of course, our police records also detail many much more traumatic events. So there are numerous references to returning escaped lunatics to the asylum, so finding people who are vulnerable and wandering and transporting them back to the asylum. There are investigations of suicides and attempted suicides, for instance that of Angus Kennedy, crofter in Elan Shona in 1898. And there are also reports of individual events. So, for instance, there are bundles of papers relating to crashed planes in the Second World War, needing to go through the wreckage to look for bodies washed ashore on the beach, murders, missing persons, rape, child poisoning. It was then, and of course it remains, an incredibly difficult, stressful, and very high emotion job. And I wanted to finish by sharing with you a story that was researched by my lovely colleague Valerie. I know you will have heard me mention Valerie in Nucleus quite a few times, a woman of great knowledge on lots of subjects. This story she researched shows how the police records, some of which are difficult to read and uncomfortable, but how they can be used in conjunction with other collections that we look after. In this instance, the Latheran Poor Relief records. Rather than paraphrase what Valerie has written, I'm going to just read to you the way Valerie sent it to me. And you'll see why, although there are those fun stories and those all sorts of cheerful wee things that happen in these records, there are also some very difficult things. The Latheran Combination Poorhouse served the parishes of both Latheran and Wick. It was located on the east side of Causeway Mire Road to the north of Latheran at Braehungy, so this is all in Caithness. It was built in the late 1850s and had accommodation for 50 inmates. The charge that she is looking into here. On Tuesday the 12th of January 1915 or Wednesday the 13th of January 1915 at the Latheran Combination Poorhouse, you, George MacDonald, did assault George Rosey, an inmate of the said Latheran Combination Poorhouse, and did strike him several blows on his head and his face and other parts of his body with your fists, and also with a pair of braces or other instrument, whereby the said George Rosey was mortally injured, and died on the 16th of January 1915. You did thus kill him. So the witnesses are called. Witnesses are the governor and matron of the poorhouse, plus 4 other inmates, 2 doctors and a police sergeant. The victim, George Rosie, who was 81, had been admitted to the poorhouse on February the 9th, 1914, with a debility. When he was admitted, he was observed to look frail and had a bad cough. George MacDonald had been admitted on the 7th of October 1913, aged 21, with a deformity of the legs, but was observed to look pretty well. So the victim, the man who has died, is aged 81, the accused is aged 21, and they're both in the poorhouse. The four poorhouse inmates called all gave the same evidence. Rosie, so that's the victim, Rosie had been confined to bed since December the 6th, suffering from heart failure, but was given to getting up during the night and disturbing the other occupants of the dormitory. On the night the incident occurred, the accused had not gone to bed, but had sat up with his clothes on, being interested in strange lights seen on the road from the dormitory window. He told one of the witnesses that he thought the lights were the Germans coming. The victim got out of bed several times that night and had been put back to bed at least once by one of the witnesses. MacDonald also tried to get Rosie back into bed and be quiet, and in doing so he struck him several times across the hips and the legs with a pair of braces. The braces were shown to the court and were observed to be very light, of the type worn by boys. However, the next day Rosie had 2 black eyes and an abrasion on his nose. Otherwise he was healthy. When asked who had done that to him, he replied it was that monkey that did it, meaning MacDonald. The following day his health continued to be good, but then the next day he grew weak and he died the day after. The governor and the matron, who were a married couple, both testified that Rosie had a bad cough and heart disease and would not have been surprised if he'd died at any moment. He was only seen by a doctor about an hour before he died. The 2 doctors who conducted the post-mortem attributed his death to vascular disease of the heart, and that his injuries had probably accelerated his death. They thought that the injuries to Rosie's face could not have been caused by the braces, but by a clenched fist. Mrs. MacDonald, George MacDonald's stepmother, so that's the accused stepmother, testified that George had a most unfortunate history in the way of accidents, having broken his legs and arms no fewer than 19 times. He had been admitted to the Bignell Hospital in Wick on 5 occasions, and she said that he was somewhat weak-minded. So now we have a situation where the elderly man has been knocked down, probably out of frustration, but the younger man is perhaps maybe not entirely in control of what he's doing. The accused took his turn in the witness box, supported by crutches, and his sharp face peeped over the ledge. In animated sentences, he stated that on the afternoon of the 12th of January, the governor had come rushing up to him and said, "I hear shots like rifles and bigger ones like those from aircraft." There was great talk about conscription and taking men by force as they did in Napoleon's time, and everybody about the place was saying that it was true. He had heard that these German Zeppelins carried 41 soldiers, and he had an idea that a British aeroplane with only 2 men had chased a Zeppelin, and that the Zeppelin had got better of the aeroplane and had shot the men and landed in Lathron, and that there were 41 German soldiers coming round to massacre the inhabitants. He admitted having struck Rosie 2 or 3 times with his braces, but did not strike him with his clenched fist. The Procurator Fiscal, that's the person in charge of the court, told the jury that if they thought MacDonald's actions had hastened the death of Mr. Rosie by even 1 minute, they were entitled to find him guilty of culpable homicide. Mr. Sutherland, for the defence, asked if the jury was willing to take on the responsibility of finding the accused guilty, given that Rosie was a man who was suffering from chronic heart disease, and when the assault had taken place 4 days before his death, and there was clear evidence that for 2 days after the assault, he was perfectly well. So the person in charge of the court is saying, even if it's killed him even by a minute earlier than he would have died, then MacDonald is guilty. But the defence solicitor is saying, you better be very, very sure that you think he's responsible for this, given that the victim has chronic heart disease and didn't die immediately after the assault. The journey took 20 minutes to reach a verdict. It was unanimous. MacDonald was found guilty of assaulting Rosie with the braces only, but not of culpable homicide. The sheriff, when passing sentence, took into account MacDonald's unblemished character, but could not overlook the fact that the old man had been used in a cruel and unmanly way. The sentence was 30 days imprisonment to date from the time of MacDonald's arrest. As he had already served that time in Inverness prison, he was released, and this news was received with a hearty round of applause from a crowded courtroom. From the Latheran Combination Poorhouse Admission Register, we can see that George MacDonald was readmitted to the poorhouse in March 1915, presumably straight after his verdict. The column of the register for leaving or date of death is blank, so we don't know what happened to him. And so you see there the sort of thing the police are involved in right across these records, from the war effort to the suffragettes, to the theft of the pigeons and the canaries and the two turnips, right through to being involved in that murder or assault that took place on an 81-year-old man in the poorhouse. And you can see that there are so many stories right across these, for family history, for social history, and just for the sake of stories as well. And also on this 11th of November, interesting to note there the impact that the war was having on them, that fear that that Germans had landed, that they were coming in, that people were frightened, and at the same time the police are going out, administering the special military area, getting the conscripts together. I hope you've enjoyed this week. I'm sorry I've run over a little bit. Please do join me next week. Next week I'll be looking at Sabbath breaking and breaches of discipline. So crimes committed within the view of the church. Fantastic subject, so it'll be really interesting. If you can join us at 3 p.m. today on our Lochaber Archive Centre Facebook page, my colleague Peter will be giving a short 10-minute talk about the training of the commandos in Lochaber, because it is, of course, the 11th of November. So I hope you can join us for that, and I'll see you next week. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you.